using the link. We will get started in a couple of minutes. Oops, that's wrong. I will just sit here and entertain you all. So we'll get started in just 3 or 4 minutes. Welcome, everybody. Hello, everybody. It's 7 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Welcome or welcome back to the Fall Journalism Lecture Forum if you've been here on other nights this fall. My name's Will Yerman. I teach in the Donald P. Belisario College of Communications. I'm the Norman Eberle Professor of Professional Practice. It's the longest title in the world. I'm really excited to have Madeleine Baran with us tonight. Just a few quick things and then we'll get started. I want to thank, as I always do, Joe and Shirley Eberle for establishing the professorship and the endowment that supports so many of the activities we do, including tonight. Their endowment honors Joe's father, Norman Eberle, who graduated from Penn State back in 1924, went on to a long career in journalism and writing, and this endowment honors his work. The lecture series will continue all semester. Tomorrow night, we have Lisa Wilson, who's the NFL editor for The Athletic. She'll be talking with John Affleck, one of our professors. And then next Tuesday, Tara Pixley, who's a photographer, will talk about relationships between visual documentation of protests, photojournalism ethics, and the news media's lack of diversity. So it should be a good talk. And then next Thursday night, do I have my nights wrong? No, a week from tonight, next Wednesday. Husband and wife journalist Kaina Zamaria and Jean Demby will be sharing their stories as well. If you're new to webinars, we can't see you, so you can just rest easy and sit back. There should be at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button where you can submit questions over the next hour or so. So please do that. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I'm really excited to have Madeleine here tonight, and I thank her for her time. She is the host and lead reporter for In the Dark, which is an investigative podcast. They've had 2 full seasons, working on their 3rd, she says. We're going to talk mostly about season 2 tonight, which is the story of the trials of Curtis Flowers, and we'll get into that if you haven't had a chance to listen to some or all of it. But season 1 is wonderful as well, and I encourage you to go back and listen to that. So let's get started. So Madeleine, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really thrilled to have you here. I guess we'll start with some basic questions. If you just want to introduce yourself and maybe give us a sense of your background and how you got to this place today.
Sure. So I'm the lead reporter and host of In the Dark, and I've been a journalist for over 10 years at this point, which seems kind of crazy. I went to undergrad at Hampshire College in Western Massachusetts and got my degree in, basically, Hampshire doesn't have majors, so technically, I guess you could call it comp lit, but I studied 19th and 20th century French and Russian lit and philosophy. Then I went to NYU and got like a master's, like a joint master's in French studies and journalism. And then I started working as a journalist and ended up, after some uncertainty about my career, do I want to be a journalist? Do I not? In and out of different jobs, decided, yes, I do. And so I ended up getting a really random job at Minnesota Public Radio in 2009 as an online part-time web reporter for a radio station, which makes no sense, so it's like, I was like transcribing things or whatever, but it was a good newsroom in the most important way, which is a newsroom where like the best story rises to the top. So if you can come up with a better story than the story you're assigned, which I felt like was not hard to do given what I was being assigned, then, gradually over time, you could build the trust of your editors and end up doing more and more of the work that you wanted to do. So that's basically what happened for me. I was doing, like breaking news, general assignment work, but then and that was fine and it was good, but that's not what I ultimately wanted to be doing. And so I kind of on the side, I would start to work on investigative stories, like maybe like a quick turn one day investigative story, the equivalent of like, some mix-up happened in the hospital and has that happened at the hospital before or something like that. And then gradually building into more, a 2-day, a week-long, putting in some public records requests until eventually, the editor said, okay, well, Madeleine can spend like 3 hours of actual time on this. Great. And then you just kind of build it from there. Because it is a lot, the kind of work that I do now, there has to be a tremendous amount of trust from editors because our team spends years on a story. And so, and time is precious in a newsroom. But anyways, that's how I started my career and kind of ended up here. And In the Dark was created about 5 years ago now, I guess, by me and Samara Freemark, the managing producer. We had joined a new team on the national side of our company, American Public Media, and we were trying to figure out what we were going to do. And we went for a walk, and I was telling her about this child abduction case that seemed strange to me that it hadn't been solved. And we decided that we should figure that out why it hadn't been solved, and that the best way to do that would be in a long form presentation. And we felt like this was right after Serial had come out, or maybe like a year or so. And we felt like we could do this as a podcast, as serious investigative journalists. Like that was now a space for that kind of serious work. Like Serial made that possible in a way that it hadn't been before then. And so then we got started.
So that leads me to all sorts of questions. Did you learn the radio skills just on the job? I mean, was radio something that interested you, or you just sort of fell into it?
No, I mean, I was a big public radio listener, like I always listen to public radio. I listened to a lot of, shows like This American Life or Radio Lab and other things, but I never imagined that I would do radio. I I was very uncomfortable with like the performance aspect of it, if that makes sense. You know, like I hate it. The thing I loved about print was like, no one cares who wrote the story. I mean, like maybe your mom, but probably not, you know? And so it's just, I love the anonymity. So that was very weird. Like even to just hear your voice is so like cringy and awful. So it took me a while to decide that I actually wanted to stay in radio, and I didn't, and I still sort of feel like I'm like not really a radio person. And the fortunate thing on my team is that there are a lot of radio producers with a lot of experience. So I feel like I'm still very behind. But yeah, I mean, it takes time. I basically did a combination of like sort of teaching myself the basics, then getting help from people in the newsroom, a lot of help to figure out how to do it. Because it's complicated, you know, recording in the field, voicing your own scripts, writing for radio, which is so different than writing for print. So yeah, it took a while to feel even remotely competent in it.
Well, how did you, and then we'll dive into season 2, but how do you go to your editors with the pitch, hey, we want to do this thing and it might take a year or two? I mean, I guess Serial made that seem realistic.
Yeah, I mean, so when I was in the NPR, Minnesota Public Radio newsroom, I ended up doing longer and longer investigations. And so before I moved to this new team, I did it's probably more than a year investigation that found a present day cover up of clergy sexual abuse in the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis. And so I had at that point, and prior to that, I'd worked on a project that was maybe like 6 months. So I was like building up to these longer projects. And then the company moved me over to the national side of the company to this team that just does long form work. So they did documentaries and investigations. And so at that point it was like, okay, you're going to actually do this. That's your job. Like, and it was at the end of the newsroom time period too. And then Samara Freemark was a documentary reporter. And so that was her background. So it was kind of perfect actually, because I had very little experience with documentary work. But Samara really did. And so that's kind of how it came about. But yeah, you just build it up gradually. It's also because like, I don't know, I mean, so many newsrooms are understaffed, you know, so it's like if a reporter is there's like a pressure and there's deadlines. And so if you're going to take a full day, sometimes it's like a full day on that, you know, you have to, you know, you could have done like 4 pointless stories in that same time period. You could have done weather, you could have done traffic, you could have done like a press release rewrite, and you could have named the motorist who was mildly injured yesterday on the such and such intersection, and now like you did nothing, you produced nothing. So that's what I mean about like a good newsroom that has some kind of vision. I mean, and sometimes, you know, you're going to have to do that stuff. Some of that stuff just has to be done. But I feel really grateful that I connected with editors who saw that gradually that they would rather me do this thing that I also wanted to do.
You make daily stories seem so exciting.
No, the thing I will say I love about breaking news is that it happens and then it's over. And there's something nice about that. And the constraints on doing that well are very real. Like, I don't want to downplay that. I think they can be extremely challenging to cover a breaking news story correctly. I mean, I helped out with the newsroom covering some of the George Floyd protests, and to do that work well, I don't think it's a skill that I am great at, and I really respect it. But it's just like, you know, when you're in that job and you're like, this is not really the part of this that I want to do. And so you just know you want to get to this other point.
So let's dive into season 2, because it's so fascinating to me what went on. I told you before we got started that I re-listened to it. I binged it over the last couple of days, but there's so much to it. It's so rich. Can you, I guess, start, because maybe not everyone has listened to it or to all of it, sort of summarize it and tell us the story, and then maybe tell us how you found that story to start and what made it seem like a story worth investing all this time in?
Yeah, so season 2 is about this case of Curtis Flowers. And the season asks, and Curtis Flowers is a Black man in Mississippi who was charged with killing 4 people in 1996 in a very small town furniture store. And nobody witnessed the murders. There was no DNA. There was no obvious slam dunk evidence. It was all just circumstantial. He was arrested, charged with those murders, went to trial, found guilty by an all-white jury, sentenced to death. But that's only really the beginning of that story, because Curtis goes on to appeal, to win his appeals. The higher court says the prosecutor committed misconduct in your case, but the same prosecutor just tries him again. And this goes on until he ends up at the point where I find out about the case. He'd been tried 6 times. And this was 3 years ago or so now that I first heard of it, a little longer than that. And so all by the same prosecutor, all of these appeals because of prosecutorial misconduct. And he was sort of stuck. And for me as an investigative reporter, what was interesting about the story was the power of the prosecutor. How is someone so powerful that they could keep committing misconduct, even the same misconduct. And the misconduct the prosecutor was committing was mostly intentionally striking Black people from the jury pool because of their race. And so that's what the higher courts would find. And so most of every trial that Curtis had was mostly all white, or in some cases an all white jury that often did not deliberate for very long before finding him guilty. And so like we think in investigative reporting in terms of questions. And so for us, the question of this was, how could it be that Curtis Flowers was tried 6 times for the same crime? And the answer, you know, as you hear in the podcast, has to do with the power of prosecutors for sure, but also with the role of racism, the criminal justice system, the dynamics of this town, the facts of the crime, the involvement of the witness, of the like state's witnesses, all kinds of things. I mean, primarily the prosecutor, but not just that. And the way that we got the story was very simple. So after the first season of In the Dark, we asked people for tips, and we got all kinds of tips. And you know, one of the shortest ones was just a very simple email from a woman who I wrote back to right away and has literally never returned an email. I don't even know who she is. Just was like seemed to be, as best I can tell, just a completely random person living in Mississippi, not living in that town, who said, you know, there's a guy a couple towns over, whatever, named Curtis Flowers, who's been tried 6 times for the same crime. The evidence is iffy, but he didn't stand a chance. And so right away, you know, it was one of those tips where you're like, I bet he hasn't been tried 6 times. You know, it's like sometimes people, like well-intentioned people, will like call in a tip and you're like, yeah, there's very little chance that that's accurate. Like they are confused, but she was right. And yeah, and we went through like a couple months process of making sure that was the right story, but it kept the draw that, I mean, it was such a, you know, prosecutors play such an important role in the criminal justice system. And this seemed like a excellent way to look at the power of those prosecutors. And you know, if you can be tried over and over again with very faulty evidence, with the prosecutor violating the Constitution, and you can't get out, like that seemed like the sort of thing that was worth reporting.
So part of what made me curious was, at what point in the process do you know you've got a story worthy of a season? And is it, I mean, the fact that he's tried 6 times and what that says about the system and about the power of the DA, that by itself seems like enough. But obviously, as the series goes on, you start finding all this other information. But at what point did you think it was enough? Like, by the end, it feels to me, and it feels like the evidence that he didn't do the crime, but you didn't know that going in. What if it had turned out he was guilty? And I mean, would it still have been a story? How did that all work for you guys?
Yeah, so one of the things, so we were looking at a couple stories at that point, and when we were looking at Curtis's story, we really wanted to make sure, if we had evidence that he was absolutely guilty, like if there was something that, you know, or would be so close to that a reasonable person would say, well, obviously he did it, then we probably were not interested in the story. We didn't need him to be innocent, but we didn't want him to be 100% guilty. And the reason why is because then, even if we found out all of these things, you know, the prosecutor messed up, all these things, it would still sort of seem to a lot of people, I think, like a technicality. Like the actual impact of it would probably be none in that individual case. And given that there are so many interesting things to cover, I don't know that we would have done it. So one of the first things that we did was we really we read all the trial transcripts, we read all the appeals, we read all the motions and the transcripts of the hearings that happened before the trials, just to make sure there wasn't anything that maybe was really great evidence, but just couldn't be admitted at trial. And then obviously looked at the evidence, and we realized, of course, very quickly that this was a circumstantial case. And the only piece of direct evidence was a highly suspect series of jailhouse confessions. And so we felt like, okay, there's enough ambiguity in there for us to continue. But we also talked about, well, what if we find out evidence that he did it? And that's fine. You know, and the thing that I think was so helpful with our reporting, and it's important, but it's also strategically helpful, is to really not care what you're about to find out. Like you want to find out something interesting, I guess, but you don't care what it is. I mean, like, I don't know Curtis. I wasn't friends with him. I'm not friends with the family. I'm not the defense or the prosecutor. So whatever happened, and we'll figure that out. And so that was, I think, one of the biggest issues earlier that we talked about. And actually our editor was like really into this idea of like, well, what if he is, you know, like she was almost like, well, wouldn't that be interesting? And we're like, yeah, that could be interesting. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But yeah, so that was, you know, there was just so much material too. So that was a challenge at first. The other thing too, is because we are this like serialized podcast where we have so many episodes, we're also looking for stories that are really rich in different narrative lines, you know? So and with Curtis's case, when we were doing all this background work, reading all the court filings and the trial transcripts, it was clear that there was a lot going on in this case. It wasn't just a case of, you know, the prosecutor striking African Americans from the jury. That would be enough for like an hour-long documentary. We get like very picky because we just know, having gone through it with season 1, like, so we're like, that's an hour-long documentary, but there's all these other elements that are really important. And so we felt like this is the right story. But it's the hardest thing that we do. Like, I feel like it's the hardest part of my job, is to pick the right story. It's not easy. And then you never find 2 stories, usually, that, at least I don't, the same way. So there's not like an easy process you can go through to be like, if I just keep doing this, I'll find a story. Every time they seem like they just like drop in some odd way.
So you have some ideas that you've done some initial research and decided this isn't going to be worth it.
Yeah, and a lot of the ways, I mean, the other stuff that we rejected, which I can't get into because I think other people are working on maybe 1 or 2 of them, were actually really good stories, but they just were not, like, they weren't going to take the right amount of time. Because the other thing too is our team now is 5 people full time, and so we really have to make sure that there's enough reporting, like, to do, because it's a really rare luxury to have this level of resource. And so some of the stories, I think a lot of the story tips we got were great stories. They just weren't the right for like a 5-person team full time for a few years.
This one definitely was. I mean, when you listen to the podcast, part of what I love about the podcast is how transparent you are with the work that went into it. I mean, some episodes you really talk about, you know, the database you did of Black jurors being kicked off of juries, and a couple of the other episodes, it's just, you really get a sense for what it took. And I think that was interesting to me as a journalist, but also gives the piece so much credibility. So I'm curious partly about the structure of producing this podcast, and then I'd like to talk, maybe if we have time, and depending on what kinds of questions we get, about like some of the specific episodes and characters. But how does, like, what's the process? You spent more than a year on the piece. You said you lived down there for up to a year, and I know some of the other people on your team were there for extended periods of time. So you have all this material, obviously. How do you structure it into what ended up being 11 episodes to start? And how do you balance sort of dramatic narrative with being honest in terms of the storytelling? Like, how do you decide it's a complicated, long question, but I have so many questions. How do you know when to hold something back, and whether that's fair, you know, to me as the audience?
Yeah, so structurally what we do is a couple things. So one is that we're talking about the story at a certain point, but we probably could start writing earlier. And we've talked about this for season 3, trying to sort of switch it up, but we really wrote pretty late. So we didn't start writing anything until the reporting was all but finished. I mean, I think there were a few interviews that were, so we really could have started writing, especially stuff that we know is going to happen, meeting the family, you know, things like that, talking to the victim's family. Those things are definitely going to be in the podcast, but we waited. And then, you know, we looked at, like, investigatively, like, what are our key findings? What do we find out? That's going to form the spine of the story factually. And then what we'll do is we'll make index cards of basically all the major things. So like, you know, Odell Hallman, the jailhouse informant, saying that, you know, becomes a state's witness. He goes to trial. He testifies on the stand that Curtis confessed to him. And then over here, Odell Hallman told us he lied. Then Odell's criminal record. And so we have all these things, and we have like probably like 150 index cards total for the series. And then we have an office where we put them all on the wall, and we have them like going down like episode 1, 2, 3. And there's just like really terrible tape on the back because we're going to move it like a ton. So everybody comes in and we try to plot these things out. And you know, people come into the room, like on our team, in different combinations and see different things. You know, you'll go in and be like, oh, who moved episode 3 to episode 7? That's interesting. But now we have a serious episode 4 problem, because it's like this puzzle, and it takes a while to get that right. And we go through that with people on our team and also with the editors. And we also talk through the story out loud, because sometimes it's like you realize, oh, I actually do need that background to have somebody understand this part of the story. So I need to bring in, and maybe in this case of season 2, like I need to bring in the racial history of the town before we get to this point, or whatever it is. And so then we'll start writing, and Samara and I write together, and we write, since it's radio, we actually write mostly out loud. So one of us will split up the episodes, and one will come into, like, me to my apartment. Like, I'll have one episode really roughly sketched out. Basically what I've done is just written some total scratch language and pulled some of the cuts I think we might use. And then it ends up looking nothing like that. That's just a starting place. And so like it doesn't have the same tape in it usually, and there's very little that's recognizable, but we start going through this process of telling the story out loud, and then we'll kind of mark off, we'll get to a point where it's like, I'm going to take that section and write that section. So then I'll go off and write that and come back, and then we'll revise, and we'll go through edits with our editor, and we do sound edits, which means our editor doesn't look at a script, and she doesn't look at a script until basically the lawyer review. And so she's only ever experiencing it as it's meant to be experienced, which is as an audio story, which is really important. I mean, if you're looking at a script, you can't unlook, you know, you're going to be thinking about it a different way. And then we have group edits where we bring in people from outside our team who've never heard the story before. And so the stuff that's, you know, we're so immersed in, and so is our editor, frankly, other people are like, that's very confusing, or like, that's very sad. Like, I'm very sad here. And then you just quickly rush to the next thing. And I was actually almost crying. And you're like, oh, I didn't even think that registered, you know? So that's super helpful. And then we get, you know, to final edits, and we do line edits, lawyer review, and then we do edits on the mix too. So imagine the same process for writing, but for the mix. And so we're thinking about like every little second of that, there are decisions, you know, should the music come in here, or should it come in like 1/100th of a second to the left on the track, you know? So it's really iterative, and it takes a long time. So the sooner you start that process, the better you get, because it's really, I mean, that's the biggest thing is having enough time to go through that whole process and not take shortcuts. And yeah, I don't know, it's kind of a long answer, but in terms of your question about like details and sensation, kind of sensationalism and that kind of thing, I mean, we think a lot about this in terms of actually something that a man I interviewed for season 1 told me, he used this phrase when he was talking about his own experience being sexually abused and how he was choosing to tell me the story. He used this phrase, necessary details. And so he wanted to tell me the necessary details. They didn't want to tell me the other details. And I was fine with that. And so I think about that as like a pretty great way actually of thinking about my work too as a journalist. Like, I'm not going to tell you the unnecessary salacious details about something, but if I need to tell you something that's kind of rough, then I just have to tell you it. But we also think about, you know, what are the details that create greater understanding on the part of the listener, and what are the details that are just like create this like distance where you're sort of gawking, like the equivalent of like slowing down on the side of the road because there's a car accident, and gawking. So, and also that's where a lot of the edits, especially those group edits, can be so helpful, because you can see how things are landing. And music, you know, we use a lot of music, and music is really careful too, because you can really change the entire tone of something with music. And so we're always, you know, adjusting and trying to be scaled back as much as possible.
I was thinking about certain episodes, like the gun episode. So you do a whole episode on the murder weapon, and there's this potential murder weapon found that belonged to this one guy, and maybe it was taken from his car, for those of you who haven't listened. And I should say, if anyone out there has questions, please start asking them, and we can, you know, take this conversation wherever you guys are interested in going. But so, you know, about half of that episode is about the potential where did that gun come from? How would have Curtis Flowers gotten it? All of that. And then about halfway through you say, but maybe that's not the murder weapon. And then you explain why maybe it's not the right gun and all of that. And I just wondered, that obviously has dramatic play to it and keeps us interested and keeps us moving along. But are there discussions about how much to hold back from me, the audience, and how that all plays out?
Yeah, and we talk about that a lot because we released it every week. And so there's a difference, at least in my mind, between how one individual episode will unfold, and you can't learn everything right in the first couple of minutes, versus like, you know, holding something, making, you know, we would never do something like, oh, this person looks really guilty, but stay tuned for the next episode, maybe they're innocent or something, you know, like, but with the gun, that episode was really challenging to write, actually, because there were all these things that were happening and they were messy, and so one of the things that we did with that episode is we just practiced just tell me the story of this. And we do this like where we go around the table, and the first person does a terrible job, like whoever it is, it's awful, because it's like, oh, I forgot, as soon as you know the story, I forgot these things and then that, and actually, by the way, I meant to mention this thing. And so the next person gets better and better and better. And with the gun, it was like there was so much going on that we felt like we just needed to get that done, and then sort of say, but especially because it wasn't going to damage anyone. Like, that's not the sort of thing that we're casting suspicion on a particular person by saying maybe it wasn't the gun. But it is building suspense. And I do think like, it's really important. I mean, you don't want to use these devices in a sensational way or in a dishonest way. On the other hand, I really think that it's so important when you're doing this kind of work that you believe is important and you want it to resonate with people. Like, you actually are not going to be shy about the fact that you want a lot of people to pay attention to the story. Then you have to spend so much time on the storytelling. Like, I mean, we live in like a very distracting world. I have like, you know, I could go into Netflix and I have thousands of options, and that's just Netflix. Like, there's so much stuff. And so how are you going to break through that as a writer, as a journalist, to say, this is what you should spend time with. This is important. That is a big challenge. And so I think a lot of the ways that I did this earlier in my career would be like to try to like show you that I spent so much time on it that you should definitely care. And so you get the like standard paragraph that's like, a such and such investigation, which lasted 6 months and involved this much time and this many like, no one cares about that. Like, that's, you know, that's the sort of thing like you write because it's like you're used to seeing that. So trying to instead like use a lot of like techniques from great storytellers, whether those are like magazine writers, like Pamela Coliff is incredible, or whether that's documentary filmmakers, or whether that's even writers of fiction, just when we're talking about the writing itself, and really spending time with that. Because if you spend so much time on the reporting and you believe it's important, it would be so sad to have nobody care about it, you know. And so I think that like that's, to me, has been maybe the greatest thing that I've learned from being on this team is all on that side of it. So I think on the one hand, we're trying to not manipulate the listener. On the other hand, we are bringing the listener through a journey, and we're not shy about that. You know, I mean, there are like highs and lows in the podcast, and there are moments of sadness. There's moments, I mean, I think we specialize in this like emotion. We specialize in the outrage emotion, I think, more than any other, where it's just like, oh, come on, you know, we're also trying to build to those. And so we do that very intentionally.
So I want to change directions. We have a question. Actually, Katie O'Toole has a question, but I'm going to build up to her question with some others first. So, so you talked about, you know, race playing a part in this story. You know, the accused is Black. It's a white DA. The town itself is divided about 40-60, but it also feels like there's a real divide. Blacks stick to themselves, whites stick to themselves. I wondered, as a reporter in town, how you, especially living there, like how you navigated that and what it was like talking to the Black community and then talking to the white community. And then we'll kind of get to Katie's question.
Great. Yeah, and so we didn't live right in the town because there's something that felt like intrusive. In a town it's about 4,000 people, it just seemed like too small. And also we didn't want to live in the jurisdiction of the district attorney. So we lived like, if you look at a map, all the places we lived are like right outside. So we lived like a drive away, but just not right in town. And the way that we structured our reporting is we had a very specific order in which we wanted to conduct these interviews. And so it just so happened that the very first thing we wanted to do was talk to the state's witnesses. We did not want a situation where we were talking to someone else first, who then figures out these people are messing around in the case or think something like that. Then all of a sudden, all the witnesses are told there's going to be a person named Madeleine coming, knock on your door, and don't talk to her, you know. And so then the witnesses might not be very forthcoming. So we intentionally went to talk to the state's witnesses first. The state's witnesses, by and large, were Black. And so the whole first summer of the reporting, like about 3 months or so, we were only really talking to people in the Black community in Winona, with some exception, but very little actually. So we were getting to know a ton of people in the community that, like on the Black side of town, and we were becoming 100% well-known because it's a small town. So you show up, it's a weird day one, it's weird hour one. And, you know, we were just up front, we're public radio reporters, we're reporting on the criminal justice system, we're looking at the Curtis Flowers case. And, you know, there was a real shared belief that reporting into the criminal justice system was important amongst the people that we're talking to, a lot of people, at least that summer. And so we were very welcomed. Like, we were invited to church, we were invited to, as the fall began, with fall football, got to know one of the coaches. I mean, it was a whole experience where we felt really supported actually by the community and the work that we were doing, acknowledging all the time that because it's such a small town, we are always keeping a distance because everybody that we're interacting with has some connection to the story. But it just felt very welcoming. Then kind of towards the end of the summer into the fall, we kind of transitioned into interviewing more people from the white side of town. And then also that's when our reporter, Parker Yesko, started going into all these courthouses and scanning all these documents. And courthouses and the clerks there, it's pretty mixed, but it's more of a white space. And so now it was like, okay, now here we are on that side of town, and we're interviewing, we started interviewing victims' families. I think we started actually interviewing them over the summer, but they were sort of spread out, and so it was sort of different. And then the reaction on the white side of town was different, and it changed a lot too over time. Started out sort of like a little bit amused or suspicious, I think. And these are generalizations, but I will say that like there's still only one white person in Winona who I've met who thinks Curtis didn't do it. So it's really that stark. And it's not that every Black resident thinks he's innocent. I mean, I don't know, I haven't pulled the town, but I have talked to people who are like, well, I don't know what happened, but it's messed up. Like, and so anyways, that's just the reality. But yeah, the white community was very much not interested in us being there and thought it was very odd. And, things would happen, like our reporter Parker got kicked out of a high school football game by the superintendent of the public schools, who said, who sent you down here to the football game? The ACLU or the Southern Poverty Law Center? Like, it wasn't subtle. And then, and there were some like concerns around that, or certain kind of interviews that we went with two people. And then after Curtis got out on bail, that's where we really felt like the white community was more openly hostile to us. Before, they would like tolerate us as people that were so confused they thought they were probably sent here to free Curtis or something, but they became kind of more angry at us once Curtis got out.
So that leads me to the interview with Bobo's dad. So Bobo's one of the victims. He's a teen or young man, right, who gets killed.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the only one that actually makes it to a hospital. Am I remembering
right.
correctly?
Yeah, everyone else is dead. It's at the store. Mm-hmm.
So his dad, I think, has to pull him off life support, and so pretty awful. And he clearly believes, at least during the interview, that Mr. Flowers is guilty. At what point did you interview him, and why did he agree to talk? And what's the experience like interviewing someone who's so convinced of what he believes?
Yeah, I feel like the victims' families, we interviewed him pretty early on. I can't remember exactly what month, but it was pretty early on in the process. He lived kind of out a ways in Samara, and I went and talked to him. And it was really sad. He had named his dog he had another son he'd named after his son. He also had a dog he'd named after his son. The front room of his house was just his bedroom. It was a really small house, and there were just this big photo of his son, like his high school photo. This guy, he had not, how could you ever recover from that? But he really had not. It was so raw. And I think in that interview, it was like, you felt like you almost needed to like hold him back a little, like you didn't want it to quite go to where you were thinking it was capable of going. Like, I was just sort of concerned for his own like mental health. It was just really raw. On the other hand, like, we called him in advance. And he absolutely wanted to talk. He wanted to talk about his son. The story that you hear in the podcast, which he's also such a good storyteller. He's such a good describer of his experience. And we talk about that all the time. We're like, Randy Stewart, he's so amazing in his ability to describe his experience in such detail. And so it was great to be able to talk to him. And it's clear, I feel like I had such a good impression of what his son was actually like. And I think that's so important. In terms of, I feel like I put the victims' families in sort of a different category than the rest of the white community, because I don't know, what it would be like to go through this experience. And, you trust the prosecutor tells you this is who killed your family member, and you believe that. And then you're being forced to try to see if you really still believe that. And then you've gone through 6 trials, like you've gone to trial 6 times. Now, having said that, Randy Stewart has some very strong feelings, including he wanted to, and we hear this in the podcast, he wanted to harm Curtis, he wanted to shoot him, he wanted to kill him. He had planned to do that. And so it was complicated. But I think you kind of see that in the interview. And so, yeah, I don't know. As far as I know, and I'm not aware of any of the family members of the victims having changed their mind as to who committed the murders. But I think that's sort of understandable. I view that as different than someone reading the paper in town, who can have a more removed approach to
right. And this leads to Katie's question. She asked specifically, do you think your podcast changed any white minds? and I don't know if she means in town or just in general, but do you feel like it had any impact on the community?
I mean, lots of people listened to it, and we weren't even sure if that was going to be the case, because it's like hard to listen to. I mean, podcasts are not the most intuitive thing actually to listen to, and there really wasn't like a culture of listening to podcasts in the town. We got really lucky with some like people who really helped, would go on Facebook and be like, okay, everybody, like open your phones, like, and I'm opening the comments here, so just ask me your questions about how to listen to In the Dark. So it ended up being listened to by a lot of people in the town. One of the things, I mean, I did not encounter any white people actually living in Winona who changed their mind. And in fact, if anything, I mean, Jeffrey Armstrong, the man who says he found this other gun, basically just across the train tracks from the furniture store, kind of going away from where Curtis lived and therefore away from the state's case, a gun that is now missing. He knew, I mean, he was very aware of this, that this could happen, but he got a lot of hostility from his fellow white residents, and he moved to an undisclosed location because of it, which did not surprise him that that was what would have to happen, but that did happen. There were lots of, I mean, I have talked to white people outside of Winona, just like the next town over, who have changed their mind about the case, and other people throughout Mississippi, other, like, you know, we're really talking, I mean, it was pretty racially divided, but there were, you know, also people that just didn't know what to make of the case, of, you know, regardless, and didn't realize that there was this massive, now it's clear, according to the courts, injustice that had been unfolding, you know, for 20 some years. They thought it was just a quirky case that kept getting tried again. And so, you know, there were people that had changed their mind, and, but yeah, not in the town as far as I'm aware. But yeah, I mean, I do think people throughout the state change their mind, and that also creates a difference in the case too, because where it ended up ultimately is the state attorney general has to decide whether to drop the case, whether to ask for it to be dismissed. And I think at that point, which happened very recently, it wasn't like there were like still a lot of people like really vocally saying Curtis Flowers is guilty and the AG better not do this. It was like, no, obviously the evidence against him is extremely flawed. You know, so it's not really politically risky, it didn't seem, for the attorney general to drop the case.
And that's largely because of the podcast and the information you guys brought out. I mean, is it?
I think that that's fair to say, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe individuals in the town didn't change their minds, but it at least had some change of the culture of the state. Do you think there are bigger impacts of the piece? I mean, on the criminal justice system, either at the state level or like, does this ripple out at all?
I think that, so the jury analysis that we did has been of interest to people across the country. There's so little, there have been studies, a handful of other studies similar to ours, where in a particular city or county, or even in one case, a state, you know, kind of a sampling of felony trials to look and see whether there's racial disparity in jury strikes. And every time that's happened, they've found a racial disparity, not that surprisingly. But those studies are still rare enough that they're of interest to defense community, they're interested to judges, they're interested to people, they're interested in changing the criminal justice system. And they're interesting to people who just want to find a way to figure out who to vote for district attorney or county attorney. And so we've heard from people in all those categories. And one of the things that we did was we put all of our raw material on our website so that we had researchers replicate the study and publish an academic journal. And so that was great. And so I do think it's raised this question, it's renewed this interest in this question of what happens in jury selection. And I think has highlighted that problem. I mean, if you have a situation, not only just for the defendant, where he's, you know, Black and always being tried by a white or nearly all white jury, but also you're a Black resident in town, and this is a big, important part of being part of a democracy, being able to serve on a jury. You know, I mean, what greater power could you possibly have, especially in a state that has a death penalty, than the ability to decide whether the state should execute someone? And yet this had been taken away, basically. I mean, that's what our study showed, from many of the Black residents of this place. And so that, I think, has resonated. And I think too, the more work that we can do always, and not just our work, but lots of work, and I'm sure you're all, like many people watching this are familiar with, the smarter we can be as jurors, should we ever be a juror, and I actually want to be one, but I'm probably not going to be one. unfortunately. But you know, we can be smarter when we're up there, and also we can be smarter in smaller ways. You know, like when we hear a news story, a person who seems obviously guilty, who's just been arrested, and the prosecution says, well, the case against him is rock solid. Maybe we can learn to just sort of like wait and see what the evidence is.
How do you think it's changed your outlook on things? I mean, besides maybe a greater desire to be on a jury.
I don't know that it's really changed my view, honestly, of the criminal justice system. I mean, I think, you know, in the details, I wasn't sure what we would find in our study, actually. I was thinking that we might not find that stark of a disparity, or that it might not always exist, but it existed in every combination of types of trials: Black defendant, white victim, Black victim. So that was a little surprising that it was that to that level. But yeah, I mean, as an investigative reporter who's covered the criminal justice system, like, you know, I guess one thing that sort of has stuck with me is that was a little bit different than what I had experienced before. Because I, you know, like, live in a city, not a huge city, Minneapolis. I grew up in Milwaukee. I've never lived in a small town. But in Winona, was really nothing, for no resources, no person you could go to if you had been the victim of the criminal justice system. Like you had been mistreated in some way. I mean, there was like the public defender who thought you were guilty anyways, and like would just tell you that and would tell it to a reporter, oh, they're all guilty. You know, there's no thing that I'm so used to, you know, even like a group, or like not even a branch of the NAACP, but just a guy who's, you know, got a law degree, or who has some extra money that could help you get an attorney. So like some of it was so stark, you know, while you know, for example, the Flowers house burned down, and it seemed suspicious, and yet it was never investigated. The pastor who gave the eulogy for Curtis Flowers' mother's funeral, where he really encouraged people to stand up and to not be so frightened, shortly after he gave that eulogy, his house burned down mysteriously in the middle of the night, and he was the only one home, and he ran out, and fortunately he was fine, but the house was destroyed. As far as we can tell, there's no investigation. So just like that level was surprising to me, I think.
And I wonder, I forget his name now, the judge you interview who talks about this really is how the system, proof that the system is working. The series of things that Doug Evans did that were so obvious and blatant that he kept getting away from, was that surprising to you, or did you sort of think that that was sort of business as usual?
I was surprised at 6 trials, you know, because at a certain point you would think that you would stop, but then again, Curtis was not going to take a plea. And so, you know, here you have the prosecutor who's very locked in. I have the right person. This is the murderer, says the prosecutor. But he cannot stop himself from violating the Constitution. So he keeps not being able to get a conviction that withstands appeal. And so that conviction keeps getting reversed over and over and over again. And I just think, like, the fact that he would go and do the exact same thing again over and over, I mean, that is surprising, I guess. But the fact that the idea that a prosecutor would abuse his power, of course, is like not surprising. I mean, and I don't mean that's just about prosecutors, but I would say the same thing about a judge, you know, or, you know, anybody else in the criminal justice system. So he wasn't unique there. But I think, you know, also thinking about the fact that this district attorney is, you know, if he was in the federal system, he'd have a boss. And that boss could say, you're not trying this case anymore because you can't get a conviction to stick. And like, we're probably going to demote you from trial work in general for a little while, or whatever they would say. But as a district attorney, he's the elected prosecutor. He can do what he wants. And in his case, and in lots of cases, no one almost never ran against him. So really the voters, he had no boss, because his boss was supposed to be the voters. But when there's no opponent, you know, that's, I think, how you get that extreme situation that Curtis was facing.
So I want to come back to Doug Evans just a little bit, but there's a question that came in. Let me see if I can read it. Did you ever worry that you were getting too close to your sources emotionally?
Mm-hmm. No, I don't. I mean, worried aware in a general sense, but actually no, because I like live in fear of getting something wrong. And so our team is really not hanging out, like we're not friends with our sources at all. And if I were to see anybody on our team, or if I were to be getting close to that line, there's a whole team of people to be like, what are, this is seeming, and I think, of course, you feel on like a human level for all the people that you're talking to, but this is a story where it's like those people, like the people who've been victims of this case, exist on both sides and kind of in the middle. Like the witnesses in a way are victims, the victims' family members are obviously victims, and Curtis is, I think, also a victim of this, especially now that we know that his conviction's been fully overturned and they're not retrying him. But I think you keep track of it. I mean, this is like what an editor's for too, but I think, whatever your natural human inclination is to like be sad when another person is sad, or be, happy when another person is happy, still exists, but there's just so much fear. I mean, I feel like that's my main, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's really my main feeling a lot of times in investigative reporting. Like, what are all the ways I may be getting this wrong? What are the things I'm not seeing? And in the case of the family, actually, it's kind of interesting with Curtis, because his family had a very specific idea about why the witnesses for the state were saying what they were saying. And that idea had to do with, they thought that they got a reward. They thought they had lied to get money. And though they didn't appear to have gotten money, they thought, well, surely they did get money and they just are lying about that too. And that's what a lot of people thought, not just people in the Flowers family. And that's what the defense had thought too. But that's not really what happened. What happened was, we found in the podcast that by and large, a lot of the witnesses for the state felt pressured to give statements that weren't true. Like they felt intimidated. And so there's also a danger in treating your people as experts, because they might just not know. If someone tells you a theory about something, it's just a theory. And so there's also that distance. Like you want, sometimes in a story, you want some guides, but you also want to entertain the intellectual exercise that your guides could all be taking you down a trail that like leads off a cliff. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. But there must have been was there a tipping point where you finally were like, I'm pretty sure he's innocent? And did that change your relationship with the Flower? I mean, I know you never get to meet Curtis, but his family, his mom who dies before he gets out, and then his dad. And
yeah, I mean, for the longest time, like the way that I viewed it was, there's no more evidence against Curtis than there is against anyone else in the town. And I still think that's probably the fairest way to view it. Like, I don't go around town being like, all these other people committed these murders. That would not make any sense. And so I view it that way. On the other hand, I'm a reporter. So if someone were to come to me and say, here's some evidence, I don't have an opposition to looking at that evidence. Now I've investigated this story for so long that I really feel like I've looked everywhere, and I don't feel like there is any evidence like that. But again, if there was, I mean, that's always the thing. It's like maintaining still that little bit of distance. No, I don't think he did it. But if he would, I'm not making a commitment to proving his innocence. Like there's still a difference. And I don't think I even got to and the podcast really wasn't about his innocence or guilt in a way. Although I do think that that it would not be very compelling if he was absolutely guilty. Wouldn't be that worth listening to or reading. But yeah, that's why it was sort of strange, actually. And people, have said after Curtis got out, congratulations or something. Like, it doesn't seem like the right statement directed to the journalists. It's like, that might be something said to Curtis or the defense attorneys, but it's like awkward when people say that to us, because we're like, well, that's not really, like, again, we need to be really open to just the facts.
But the facts certainly support, so we don't know absolutely that he did or didn't do it, just like anyone in town, but that justice was not served. He was not treated fairly by the system. So
right, and there's no evidence, just to be super clear, there's no evidence. There appears to be no credible evidence against him.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a question from somebody, have you stayed in touch with Curtis Flowers? What's your contact with him?
Yeah, so I have talked to him just a handful of times, and I haven't sat down and done like a sit down interview yet, but I'm hoping to do that relatively soon. And looking forward to that, because of course, as you know, in the podcast, we weren't able to talk to him the entire time we were reporting until like very recently.
Huh. That'll be, so I assume you'll do that as an extra episode of the
Yes.
season. That'd be great to hear. So I want to circle back to Doug Evans before we run out of time, just because he's so fascinating. I'm partly curious about, and I think for, a lot of journalism students are listening, watching right now, you only get one time to really talk to him, where you kind of camp out in his office and he comes out and you describe, I remember you describe him, he kind of leans up against the wall. You do a lot of that, of describing the scene without editorializing, but it felt like it was like the posture of someone in power kind of imposing himself. At least that's how it felt from the description. But how do you approach what's sort of a hostile kind of environment? You were very both, and it's not just you, right? I think, is it Samara's there with you maybe, or
Parker was there
Parker maybe, or somebody, it's another reporter, but you're both very polite and also very persistent, and you just talk for as long as you can kind of keep them going. And I'm wondering if maybe you can talk about what that was like, and then also strategies that students might be able to take away.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the biggest things is how to approach a kind of interview like that. I feel like there's a tendency to like do your like nice interviews where you're all respectful, and then do your angry interview where you're very upset and you're going to yell at your questions instead of talking in a normal way. And then you're surprised, like, or then you're like, that person was such a jerk to me and they like slammed the door in my face. It's like, yeah, no kidding, because you were like literally yelling at them, or you were like, I accused you of the following crimes and what will you say to this? So I feel like my number one thing is to just try to have a normal conversation. Try to be like a level person, and because you are genuinely curious and up for whatever the person has to say, you need to make sure that that's coming across, because no one's going to talk to you if you just seem like a jerk, or you're not listening, or your mind's made up, or whatever. And so I think that's like number one. So I don't go in with this like kind of like revved up energy that you see, I think, a lot in kind of stereotypical investigative reporting. That is very different than how basically every investigative reporter I've ever met done. I'm not claiming to have invented a new strategy, but I think like that's like number one. And then, I do a lot of like role playing actually of interviews, and thinking about, not so much a list of questions, but what do I want to find out? What's the most important thing to find out in this interview? And how am I going to get there? And then, maybe I have some ideas of a question, but I will role play, like literally role play with someone else in the team. They'll play Doug Evans, I'll be me. And then, and we'll play different versions of it, like angry guy who has only 2 minutes, or someone who says, like, do you want to go out to lunch? And then you go out to a 2-hour lunch, and then you go to the office for 3 hours. And then finally you're like, what, Doug Evans, I have somewhere I have to be, so, like all of those kind of things. It's super important, because we knew that, we'd already tried to talk to him several times, like called him, write him letters, sent him notes, nothing. So we knew that we probably would not have that like 5-hour version. And so it was really helpful, is just knowing in the moment what I wanted to jump to. And I remember thinking like, I thought to myself, like, I feel like I have like 3 more questions before he stops. And I was like, oh, and I had an idea for 1 more question I was going to ask, but then I was like, what if I only have 1 more question? I need to tell him about Odell Hallman. And so then I was just like, I tell him that he told us his testimony was a lie. And then I think that was the last question, because then his like junior attorney comes and legitimately does need a mileage form signed, which is the most unfortunate piece of bureaucracy I've ever encountered. And so then he like signed it, but then he kind of used it, Doug Evans, to sort of leave, go back into his office. But yeah, you really, like, we had practiced that, like that exchange. And imagine too, when you're talking to some people like Doug Evans or other powerful people, there's this stuff that they really like to talk about, but you're aware that you have limited time. So he really liked to talk about the role of the media. He could have talked about that for like an hour. And I was grateful for his perspective on the media, actually, and you do hear it in the interview, but that was going to be a time waste. And so you also, in the interview like that, you have to sort of cut things off that you are like, that is not important, and I am making that decision. Like, that's your job too in the moment. Which is not the case when you have unlimited time. You never want to do that, but sometimes you have to in those moments. And then I think the other thing too with any interview is like, you have to figure out, of course, why would this person talk to me about this particular thing at this particular moment? And so that holds for Doug Evans or for anybody, Curtis Flowers, his family members, the neighbor. And then that becomes part of the strategy for how you're going to begin that conversation, and kind of how you're going to navigate, especially the very beginning of it. And then once you've done all that stuff, like once you've role played, you know what you want, to find out, what you need to find out. You're open to everything else. You're open to having a totally different experience. You're going to be curious, why this person's going to talk to you, have ideas for what you're going to say right away. And then if they say these 3 things, what you might say, then you just like deep breath or whatever. And you're just like, okay, I feel great about this. Like, and I'm imagining this is going to go really well. And I think that part's really important too for me, because if I'm feeling like not prepared or uncertain about the strategy that I'm about to use, I feel like I'm bringing that kind of bad, nervous energy to the interview. And that is going to make the other person also nervous. Like I talk about it sometimes on our team. It's like if you went to a doctor or a dentist who was very nervous about what they were going to do, like it'd be almost apologizing for it. Like the root canal, like, I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. Like this is going to be a tense procedure. Just do your job, please. So I think that setting like a calm, low-key moment where anything is okay to be said is like creating this container for whatever happens is a really important part of that.
Did you ever get a chance to talk to him again, even off the record, or have you heard from him?
I've never agreed to talk to him off the record, and we've never talked to him off the record. But he's never, sometimes in exchanges, he will say, well, I want to talk to you off the record. And we're like, no, but he's never asked for an off the record conversation. Yeah, every time we would see him around, he would talk to us a little bit. So, he just is sometimes hard to find, but not that hard to find. So if I was down there right now, I'm confident that he would still talk to us. It's just sort of like the pace of life. We could never get what we really wanted, which was like a longer interview, but we were able to talk to him like kind of similar to the setting in The Office in like the later episodes. Like there's a time where Parker goes and finds him outside doing some repairs on a rental property that he owns. But yeah, his perspective was, this is dumb. I don't want to do this. You guys are meddling in this case. But I also thought it was, to me, important to see how he kind of like wasn't like someone who had, you hear the same prosecutor 6 times. You think this guy's going to, have a poster on the wall, a courtroom sketch. He's going to be obsessed with this case. These are just assumptions that are obviously not true when you go meet him. Like, it's sort of like shrug of the shoulders. He's obviously guilty. I'm not losing any sleep over it. It's sort of like the feeling of a complete unchecked power. Like he's never had to answer questions about this before. He doesn't have like a whole lot to say about it. It's just obvious. And so to sort of see that kind of like shrug of the shoulders, slouched against the wall kind of demeanor, I thought was interesting.
It's interesting you say that, because it feels to me as a listener like there's all this evidence of maybe intentional deceit on the part of his office. If not him, then John Johnston or some of the other things, the reports that didn't get, that you think exist, that you can't find, and that kind of stuff. But you seem to not.
Well, I guess
or just not know.
Be true. I think as best I can tell, just in using some of Doug Evans' own words, which we can decide to reject or not, I never found any evidence that Doug Evans doesn't think Curtis did it, which is different from, did Doug Evans do things to make a conviction more likely? But I do think generally that he's like, the guy's guilty. He's guilty. He needs to go to prison. He needs to be executed. That's the 3 things that are true for Doug Evans. And like, the details of it are just seem to be sort of ways of getting to the obvious conclusion. However we get there, I'm not going to tell you about that. I'm definitely going to do things according to courts that were prosecutorial misconduct, like a finding of fact by many courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. But in general, I'm doing the right thing, is basically his approach.
It's a fair way to look at it, I guess. Another question came in. Was there anything that you intended for the podcast but ultimately put on the website, and how did you decide what to, I guess, include in the...
Yes, there's a lot. And I love having a website where we can, because there were things like, I think photo lineups are a good example. There are these photo lineups that were not the most important in Curtis's case, but were like, they weren't key evidence against him, because most of the people who said they saw Curtis just knew Curtis, and they were like, there's Curtis. But there was some very biased use of photo lineups, like very much not best practices. There was a whole alternate theory of who committed the murders, involving these guys, these kind of like young men, teenagers, I think maybe even from Alabama, who had been on a crime spree in Alabama. And did they ever come into Mississippi? The defense was very interested in this as a defense strategy. We had a reporter, Curtis Gilbert, on our larger team come in and work on our team for months. He traveled to Alabama, he went to Massachusetts. He was trying to figure out were these guys ever in Mississippi? Found no evidence of it. And so we're like, well, we're not going to put that in the podcast. However, that was a lot of work, and the defense is claiming that this might have happened. So we're going to put our reporting online for that. And then there's other roads that you go down as a reporter that never end up anything. You know, one of them would be like we were looking at, there was some organized crime, like local organized crime. A sheriff who was indicted in the 80s. And we looked to see if there was any connection between that and any of the people involved in the story, or any connection in any way, and we didn't find any. So that would be an example of something that is just not in the podcast at all or on the website.
Were there things that you suspected or had some inkling of that you just never could nail down, that you wished, like, what do you wish the story had?
I wish we knew who did it, you know, I guess that would be great for everyone to know for sure who did it. To me, that's probably the biggest missing piece.
You had earlier had mentioned Serial as sort of, you know, it's in a way made this kind of thing possible. It was sort of the breakthrough, you know, it sort of made podcasts sexy, I guess. And, you know, the similarity is this kind of investigation into a crime, but very different in terms of style. And I wonder how you thought about style when you were putting this together, and did Serial influence you either one way or the other?
I mean, I'm sure it did in certain ways. I agree with you that style is very different. I mean, to give you an example of how different I think it is, I was of the opinion starting in the dark that it would be weird to have a moment where I say, I'm Madeleine Baran. Like, that's weird. And then Samara was like, you need to tell them who this voice is. Like, it's just, I was like, I didn't want to be in the story even to the point of having my name, but like, do I really need to say that? Or maybe that could just be like in the credits or something. It's just like, no, you actually have to tell the people what your name is. And so, but I think for us, you know, we're always like, it just depends what type of story you're trying to tell. And like the story of Serial season 1 is, I understand it. I mean, I've listened to it many times and it's really elegantly constructed. And the story is about a relationship of Sarah Koenig and Adnan Syed and this tension. And so that's just not the type of story that we were telling either in season 1 or season 2. You know, we weren't in a conversation with Curtis at all. And we were much more focused, you know, on like a kind of an investigative line into the prosecutor, into the police, into the evidence. So it just, yeah, I have tremendous respect for all of her work. And I think that we've been influenced, you know, in other ways, you know, the storytelling, strength of the writing, things like that. But yeah, we look a lot towards documentary film. That's actually probably our strongest influence, or like structurally, or sometimes fiction as well. Or even like a really good television show. There's certain aspects, Samara and I are both very into the Americans, and there's certain story structures that we will deconstruct.
So that question came in, what podcast do you listen to? And I guess to add to that, can you name some documentaries or you know, other things that have been inspired, like specifics that maybe people could go watch or listen to?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, podcasts I listen to, I'm listening right now to The Promise, which is a podcast from Nashville Public Radio that is in its second season. The first season was really great. It was about public housing and segregation in an area in East Nashville. And the second season is about the public schools, actually really 2 public schools in East Nashville, one which is majority white, one which is majority Black. And the reporter there is really excellent. So that would be one that comes to mind. In terms of documentaries, you know, like there's so many I could mention. You know, there's one that that several people on our team are obsessed with, which is kind of off the beaten path a little bit, which is this documentary called Deep Water, I believe it's called. Have you seen this? So there's a documentary about this race around the world, a sailboat race, a solo sailboat race around the world. I think it was in the 1960s. And just the structure of the story is something that we talk about a lot. There'd be major spoilers if you Googled what happened with the sailboat race. But it's just a really surprising, like gripping story that I felt like I couldn't stop watching. I was recently watching Lenox Hill on Netflix. I really like immersive documentary where you're just there. And that is a great portrait, particularly I felt, of like these neurosurgeons setting up this clinic in this New York City hospital. Those would be things that immediately come to mind.
I just watched, it's a 3-parter, Don't F with Cats. Have you seen it?
Oh, I haven't seen that yet. Yeah.
It's bizarre. but
I heard it was very bizarre.
it's very, yeah, I mean, the story is, and the telling of it is, it's quite the story. So we're just over an hour. I don't know if there are any more questions.
Oh, I think you're muted.
I am. I was being too clever. Also trying
Sorry.
to. Anyway, any last questions, and we'll think about kind of wrapping up in a couple of minutes. But so what's your next project? I know
So we can't tell you that. So we are working on season 3, but you'll have to stay tuned. It will not be happening anytime soon, coming out anytime soon.
Given your interest in film, like, is podcasting particularly appealing, or could you see making a transition to documentary film? Does that interest you? Is there what are the pros or cons of?
I am interested in it, but I don't know how to do it at all. So, I mean, it would be great to at some point partner with a documentary film crew maybe, or do something like that. But that's just not a skill that I remotely have. But we think very visually when we're writing. We think about, okay, if this was a movie, what is the opening scene? And a lot of times it's not what we end up using, but it at least helps us get into the mindset. Like with Curtis Flowers' case, we thought maybe the opening scene, because he ends up dropping these batteries off a truck and then he stops working, and that, maybe that's the scene. Maybe it opens with him, as 20-something-year-old man working this like kind of menial furniture store delivery type job, and he's hanging out and these batteries fall or whatever. I don't know if that's a great start for a movie. I don't write movies, but it just helps us to start thinking about things like that way. Or like in episode 2, where we go to the Flowers house. I think it's episode 2 for the first time. In the beginning of that scene, we kind of imagine it almost like a camera, like we're going through these blocks. Then we pass by this like flat thing that turned out to used to be a school that had been burned down. And then behind there, like we go up to the steps and there's Curtis's parents' house. So there's also like ways in which we're playing around with writing like that.
That's wonderful. I think maybe a nice way to wrap up, unless there's any more questions. There is one more. What are the job prospects like for journalism graduates who want to do what you're doing? And I guess my question was going to be, maybe coming after that, specific things you think journalism students should be studying, or skills that they should need to know, or how can they best prepare for life after college?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like I felt that what was so helpful was, I think of journalism like a skilled trade. Like I think you can only get so good at it from reading or studying. Like, and I think that is critical. I will not just dismiss that. Like if you don't have the perspective of the broader perspective, if you don't know about the ethical guidelines, if you don't get exposed to the work of great journalists and learn the strategies, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. But I think once you have that, or if you have that already, just doing the work is so valuable. Like when I was in grad school, I got an internship at the New York Daily News, primarily because it was like the only internship that paid money. And so, which I could not afford an unpaid internship. But the great thing about the Daily News was that they would just send you on these like incredibly low stakes assignments, like go to Times Square, interview, 10 people about how they feel about issue of the day or whatever. And so I got like very used to like just this act of asking a stranger to talk to me in extremely low stakes environments with a high volume. And so I think finding a job, and there's different approaches to this. Some people disagree with this advice and people are going to give you contradictory advice, but I really feel like getting to a place where you can actually practice journalism early in your career, whether that's like a smaller paper or where you can get better at it so that then you can build your career so that by the time you get to like wanting to do a bigger story, like, and I'm not saying that's like 10 years from now, maybe it's 6 months, you've gotten that experience, like you've started to build and you can tell, that you're getting better at it. Like it's coming a little easier. You're less nervous or whatever the issue is for you, because everybody has an issue, like myself included, it starts to get a little bit better. You feel a little more confident. And then I think like we kind of opened with this idea of, find a newsroom if you can, that values good stories, and do the work that you're there to assign to do, because that's important. But also think like, how can I have like another, like a side thing, a secret side thing happening, and it doesn't have to be investigations. It's like, maybe I want to do like a long feature story and there's no time for it. And my job is to just cover crime. Well, maybe you start secretly spending like literally 10 minutes a day working on that larger feature story. And then you bring it to the editor and say, I've been kind of wondering about this sort of thing. And you don't say, I've already done it secretly for months, and maybe it works. And if it doesn't work, then you just keep trying to do it. I think that's, to me, that always made more sense than like, how do I become an investigative reporter in a newsroom? Because like, well, the problem with that is that there's very few investigative reporters in a newsroom. But you can become a person who does investigative reporting in a newsroom pretty easily by just doing it. You know, being the person who files a public records request, being the person who just puts in like 10% more effort, or even frankly, a lot more earlier in your career, so that you can end up doing the stuff you want. Because otherwise, like, you never want to be the person who's just like sitting around so the editor decides that there's like some pointless story that someone needs to do. I'm like speaking ill of editors, or like a story that we should probably have that is somewhat important, but we're only going to assign it if there's someone who's not doing anything else. So you always want to be like really proactive in a newsroom, even in a newsroom. Like, I've also have colleagues who've worked in not great newsrooms. And even then there's a great value in being proactive and like having a lot of story ideas and really trying to make the job what you want it to be.
Are you hopeful in general that there's a career for journalists? If
Yes.
If you're talking to our group here.
Yeah, I mean, I am not optimistic about the long-term prospect. I mean, at this point, I know very few people who've spent their whole time in journalism, working journalists, retired. I mean, actually, I've been to only one retirement party for a journalist over the age of 60. So everyone else, it's like a layoff party, and that's just the reality. That is really unfortunate about this profession, that it's hard to stay in it for a very long time. But 20 years, 25 years, you know, actually working as a journalist before you get laid off, I guess that's my dream. But it sounds terrible.
I guess that's a positive view.
I mean, I feel like it's a crazy opportunity. Like, I'm being paid to do something that I legitimately love doing. And so I feel very fortunate about that. And I like doing it enough that I think like, I do this as a job, like, but I also recognize the financial realities of news. But I think that, you know, if it's something that you're passionate about, then how could you not do it? You know, how could you like sit there and say, well, I don't know if I'd have a job in 15 years. It's what you want to do. Like, you only have one life, like just do the thing you love. And I think for me, that was journalism. And so like, yeah, if I get laid off tomorrow, I guess I'll have to figure something out. But for now, it's working.
Well, that's a great way to end. That was great. Thank you. Unless there's any last questions, I don't think I missed any. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I know you're on the road and you're probably tired, so we'll let you go get some rest. But thank you for being here tonight.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks also to everyone on the call for all the great questions. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.
Bye, everyone. Have a good night.